How are you?
I'm doing well, Kevin. How are you?
Doing well.
Good. On my most recent video, you made a comment asking about the relationship between something like the Cardinal Virtues and the Book of Proverbs, and specifically, do they need each other? Is that a good way to put it?
Yeah. Or do they in some way even implicitly or explicitly point to the other? But what are the potential tensions and how do we deal with that?
Yeah. So here, as I've been thinking about your question, initially I thought, okay, this is kind of a classic question about the distinction between faith and reason as two different modes of knowing something. So that's how it seemed at first. But the more I thought about it, I thought, the Book of Proverbs is really working within the tradition of something like folk wisdom. So we certainly have Proverbs in America today. I mean, you could finish the sentence if I said early to bed, early to rise, right? Or if at first you don't succeed, try again. Or measure twice, cut once. And there's these kind of short statements that have proven true. And so they're easy, much like the Book of Proverbs. It's short statements that are easy to pass down, that are true enough. I mean, it's worth mentioning that something like measure twice, cut once, it's true as a principle. Individual cases may differ, but it's true as a principle. And so there's a question of how kind of philosophy and this folk wisdom interact. And I think, as I've thought about it, I'm curious what you think about this, but as I've thought about it, I think they do depend on each other. So you'll see, so starting with something like the Cardinal Virtues in philosophy, you've seen how someone like Plato or Aristotle, when they start to ask a question, they don't disregard the common man. They don't say, the common person's confused, they don't know what they're talking about, so we're going to figure it out. Instead, they say, what do people mean when they say justice? What do people mean? They're looking for the kind of common usage, right?
Like the starting point.
Yeah. So they'll sort of start there and then extrapolate. And it's not as obvious how folk wisdom relies on philosophical systems. At first, you'd want to say they're coming up with things that are true. The normal person is coming up with things that are true and sharing wisdom, passing it along to their kids. And they're not waiting to hear if Immanuel Kant agrees with them, right? They're finding what's true and what works. That's what it's like at first.
No, and I think any ethical system worth its salt functions like that. Certainly as people live it out practically, right? You don't have to subscribe to a certain philosophical or even theological position in order to act virtuously.
Yeah.
Maybe despite what Dostoevsky would say, or some other people might want to say. And that's probably a good thing, right?
Yeah.
But I do maybe want to challenge a little bit the notion that Proverbs is reduced to this kind of folksy tradition independent of the context within which it's written, which starts off with the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So how do you deal with at least his audience, himself, that initial statement, how this all hangs together? And are you comfortable with just, for lack of a better word, divorcing it from that theological framework?
And I guess, and maybe I'm evading your question when I say this, but as I think about how a book like Proverbs relies on a more philosophical, theological framework, I think for me, I would look at the way that the three wisdom books of Job, Ecclesiastes, and Proverbs kind of hang together. So Proverbs is giving this really practical, work-a-day kind of wisdom. Here's how you get by in the world, right? This is the kind of stuff you teach your kids. This is how you're going to get by in the world. And it almost always works, except you still got these basic existential problems that come up after Proverbs fails, right? After you've done everything you're supposed to and you're still not happy or whatever, that's when Ecclesiastes comes in and says, yeah, because you've got these huge existential problems that we haven't taken care of yet, or you did everything you were supposed to and tragedy still struck, right? As it does in Job. And so it seems to me that Proverbs is relying on philosophy more externally than internally. It's like Proverbs doesn't stand alone. It's not the sum of Revelation. Instead, you've got these other philosophical books that are sort of rounding it out outside of that particular book.
Yeah, it'd be. I don't know what that means to say it's relying on philosophical frameworks. I'm not sure that, even from a theological perspective, that would be a controversial statement.
Maybe so, yeah. Maybe more than I recognize.
But Yeah, no, to me, I think this is fascinating. I guess a question for you is, what motivated you to interplay between these two traditions? To me, when I think about it, I automatically go towards revelation, reason, faith, all this sort of distinction as I hear about it, because I just think about it in a historical context.
Yeah.
And to me, it's fascinating. What caused you to think about discussing how these two fit, compare, contrast? Was there something motivating that?
There was a specific event that caused me to look at these two sources, and it was about 13 years ago. I was sitting on my porch on Congress Street, and Carrie came up and told me that she was pregnant, and so it was like, okay, we got a big change in our life going on. And you know me, Kevin, I think you're the same way, where I'm trying to look for a theoretical framework to understand what the hell I'm doing, because otherwise I'll just be unsatisfied, just trying to get by and get good advice, but if like I don't really understand what I'm doing. And so that quickly led us to questions of, what does it even mean to be a person? What is a successful person like? And we got a lot of unsatisfying answers. The exception were these two sources. The Book of Proverbs is written from a teacher to a student, from a parent to a child. It's supposed to be an educational kind of book. And then, of course, this tradition of the Cardinal Virtues is specifically saying, we know what virtues are important if you're buying a knife. We know what virtues are important if you're buying a chair. What are the excellencies that make for a successful human being? And so those are both really compelling sources of like, here's what you're supposed to be doing in life, right? And they've both been kind of bouncing around and of interest to me for those 12 years, 13 years, since. And my church asked me to teach a Sunday school class, and I was like, well, I'd be curious to look more closely and see these four virtues that the Cardinal Virtues pull out. Does the Book of Proverbs agree that they're important, and does it generally define them in the same way, or are there important divergences between these two? So that's kind of the...
And I guess you have several more episodes before you really fully flush that out.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, kind of in the coming videos, I'll look into that a little more.
So in a preview to that, I guess the question would, from my perspective, is, do you see any tension between the two?
I mean, I think the main one is that of perspective. In a lot of ways, Proverbs is a book that encourages humility even more than the Cardinal Virtues do. So we'll see this as we look at something like justice. You'll see that a book like Plato's Republic is trying to answer the question of what is justice, right? And this is a question we're not through with, right? I mean, Alistair McIntyre is saying this is the major divergence in ethical thought, is we don't know what the definition of justice is. And those are really important questions. And meanwhile, Proverbs is saying, don't use different weights and scales in the marketplace, right? Don't be a cheat. It's like scolding you and saying, God is going to be incredibly unimpressed with you if you cheat your neighbor. So don't do it. And so I feel like those are both really important perspectives. Somebody needs to answer the question of, what does justice mean? And then most of us need this kind of almost threatening instruction that says, don't be a cheat. There's too many cheats out there already. You need to be honest. And I think we need parents and teachers who are telling their kids that. So those are complementary perspectives. I don't know that they're in tension, but they're a different perspective.
Yeah. And the other interesting question would be, I think that's a good perspective, would be, to what extent does the practice of one lend itself towards the need of the other, if at all?
Right.
And maybe it's not full. Maybe it can't even be fully answered in a context of just a Proverbs perspective. I mean, surely from a more Christian perspective, which is broader than Proverbs, there might be even an answer of saying even Proverbs itself has a tension within which it's not fully resolved until the coming of Christ.
Sure.
And in a new birth and whatnot. Certainly within both traditions, there's this radical importance of rearing, of what maybe you could say Christianity talks about with sanctification, although that's with explicit supernatural help. But, the Cardinal Virtues, Plato, Aristotle would be pretty explicit in that either you're reared properly and then you've got it by a certain age, or you don't. And then you're like some reprobate where there's no hope for you. And well, that's certainly potentially resolved in a Christian framework, right? So anyways, there's so much interesting interplay here that's kind of what motivated my question. But yeah.
Well, and it's certainly worth saying that this has been a controversial subject throughout Christendom. So, Luther did not like the idea of cardinal virtues, habituating yourself to these virtues. It was like, you've got sanctification or nothing, right? You're not going to make any ground on your own, seemed to be Luther's kind of perspective. And that's one that's always been a little unsatisfying to me, but I'm interested in the tension there. Another aspect of this is think about the story of the history of ethics as Alistair McIntyre tells it in After Virtue. And he talks about the kind of deontological ethics, these post-Enlightenment ethics, as one big attempt to justify morality, right? So after Copernicus and Galileo said, you're not the center of the universe the way you thought you were, then as Alistair McIntyre paints it, it's like, well, we know that we still like all the morals that we built up. We don't want to lose those. And so let's set to work trying to justify those. And so that shows a way in which this kind of folk wisdom does depend on a philosophical system. It's like we can't have too great of a divorce between practical ethics and university ethics, right? If those are in complete disagreement, we know that there's a structural societal problem. And so we need those to be at least on speaking terms to kind of get along as a society or something.
Well, and I don't know if this is pushing an issue well beyond the context of our conversation, but I mean, to that point, there's something very fascinating in 2020 to a guy getting on the internet on YouTube talking about Proverbs and the Cardinal Virtues. I mean, you couldn't think of something more to your average person, more something that would seem so ancient, and no one does that anymore. And who thinks about that? I mean, do you feel like in the course of this, you're ever going to address that at all? That there's a sense of how are you justifying even engaging in these things when for a lot of people, there'd be this thought that we've moved on from that 2,000 years ago, Brian. Why are you still dwelling on these old things?
Well, now I'm wondering, Kevin, if not really, only because people keep being interested in it. So, there are books being constantly published. There's this woman, Karen Swallow Prior, who just published this book called On Reading Well a couple of years ago that was looking at, here's how you read great literature through the lens of the Cardinal Virtues. And so people are still interested. It's kind of good enough for me. I don't know. I don't expect that it's going to interest 100% of people, but I don't know. There seems to be at least some lingering interest in these kind of greater sources of wisdom on these questions.
No, I think you're precisely right in that. I mean, any great book of literature that you're reading is going to rise up one of these big questions. That's the tension in that whole story.
All right, kind of feels like we're done, right?
Were my kids too loud in the back? They're in the bag in the back of the boat, Rosie.
No, it's great.
I have seen the bright